Wells, and this is Point to Point. My guest today is Telegram columnist Bob Wakeham. Bob has been a journalist in Newfoundland and Labrador for over 40 years. Many of those years were spent with CBC Radio and Television, where he eventually became the executive producer of news and current affairs for CBC TV. He has received many journalism awards, most recently an Atlantic Journalism Award for a piece he wrote about Beaumont Hamel called Over the Top Buys for Saltscapes magazine. And speaking of that, his most recent book is called I Remain Your Loving Son, which is also about Beaumont Hamel. This is it, edited by Bob with Francis Ennis. And I'd like to welcome Bob to the program. Great to see you again.
Great to see you, Karl.
Bob, since I'm holding the book, why don't you briefly tell us about I Remain Your Loving Son?
Well, this is a book, as you noted, that Francis and I co-edited, and it's the transcript of a number of items that I was involved in, or that Francis was involved in, concerning Beaumont Hamel. For instance, back in the year 2000, I co-produced a documentary for the CBC called I Remain Your Loving Son about Beaumont Hamel. And the transcript of that documentary is part of this book, as is the transcript of another documentary that I co-produced with Bill Coltis called The Descendants, and again about Beaumont Hamel and the people who, it was interviews with a number of people who had relatives who were at Beaumont Hamel, and also a series of poems that Francis wrote about Beaumont Hamel. And then there's a number of hooked rugs that the Holy Heart of Mary Alumni Choir put together a number of years ago to finance a trip to Beaumont Hamel. And so those are there with the descriptions from the people who put them together about what they were trying to communicate about how they felt about Beaumont Hamel. So that's basically it. There's 4 elements, and it was put out in the fall and sold relatively well, or as well as local books do sell here, you know. But it was more of a labor of love. Karl, to tell the truth, you know, neither Francis nor I think, figured that we were going to pay out our mortgages with the book. But I really enjoyed doing it. I've always enjoyed I've always enjoyed using my journalistic talents or whatever to tell the story of Beaumont Hamel, because my grandfather was there and he was shot and wounded there, so it's always been sort of a personal thing with me.
And even if you didn't have a relative there, it's a story that all Newfoundlanders take to their hearts.
They do, and it resonates in so many families, even to this day. You know, my wife Heather Coltis, her two of her great uncles were killed there. So, you know, in our home in Flat Rock, you've got a picture of my grandfather Joe Judge, Norm Coltis, and Will Knight, Heather's 2 great uncles. So these 3 guys went over the top together back in 1916. One came home and the other 2 didn't. So you're right. It's a kind of story that everybody in Newfoundland, you can't hear enough about it. At least I can't hear enough about it, or read enough about it, or see enough about it.
Let's talk about journalism.
Okay.
You started your career with the Evening Telegram, as it was known, back in the 70s. It was an interesting period because there was a lot of political stuff happening during the 70s. You covered the 1974 Liberal Convention, where I guess Joey Smallwood was trying to regain the leadership of the Liberal Party from Ed Roberts. You wrote about Smallwood, and I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of the color of that.
Well, actually, and that was my assignment on that particular weekend of the convention, was to do a color piece strictly on Joey. And you know, that particular convention, Karl, sort of gets lost in the shuffle of the more infamous '69 convention,
right,
when Smallwood, his power first started to show a few cracks, and John Crosby tried to take him on, Alec Hickman and a few others like that. But at the same time, and so the one in '74, understandably, is lost in the shuffle, found itself in the shadows of the one in '69. But still, in all, it was an interesting, fascinating convention. And for me, I was a neophyte reporter, you know, 24 years old, And to be told that I was going to chase Joey around for 2 days was very intimidating. You know, Joey to me, growing up in Gander, you know, Joey was like, he was a dictator, you know, and you'd mention his name almost in reverence. So here I was, you know, like I said, a kid following Joey around for a couple of days. And what I remember most about that particular weekend, once I sort of got a little bit half-assed comfortable in his company, was he lost, of course, to Ed Roberts, and it was a bitter convention. Roger Simmons was also there, Steve Neri was there, and they sort of ganged up on Joey. And I think Jameson, Don Jameson at the time, and Trudeau, they wanted no part of Joey coming back into the mix. So I guess the die was cast. Joey wasn't going to make a comeback, and he didn't. But anyway, on a Sunday night, I remember I thought my job was done, and my news editor at the time, Bill Kelly, who we both knew, and Bill's passed away about a year and a half ago, unfortunately. But anyway, Bill said, I want you to go to Roach's Line to Joey's house. And I said, I think I got as much as I need, Bill. I've been with him for 2 days. And he said, no, head out to Roach's Line. So out I go with Frank Boland, who was a photographer at the time. Knocked on the door, and I remember it was pouring rain. And Joey opened the door, and here's this little pup of a reporter once more, you know, bugging him. And I said, can we come in and do one more last interview with you, Mr. Smallwood? So he said, I'll be with you in a minute. And he closed the door in our faces. Of course, here was the rain pouring down. Myself and Frank, saturated wet. He came out a few minutes later. We came in, and I sat down, and I started to ask him a couple of questions about the convention. And the phone rang, and he got on the phone, and he started talking in a very Joey animated way, you know, going blah, blah, blah. And I was there sitting next to his wife, Clara. Now, Clara never spoke, as far as we know. Certainly never spoke publicly. And she was sitting there knitting, see? So I was trying to make small talk with her. I wasn't interviewing her as such. So I said, Mrs. Smallwood, what do you think about what happened tonight, Joey being defeated? And she said, I'm glad Joey's finally out of it, to tell the truth. And with that, Smallwood realized that his wife was talking to me, and he put his hand over the phone like that, and he said, Clara! And she jumped. I jumped. He said, shut up! And Jesus, we all shut up, you know. And and then he went back to talking. But I thought, again, as a young reporter, I had heard all these stories about what an incredible bully he was. And I saw it right there in his own home. I mean, he could bully the most powerful of creatures, and he also bullied his wife. But it was a great introduction to being in the company of powerful people and how they handle themselves.
Yeah, well, it's been documented, I guess, that he was a bully, because I just reread Richard Gwynn's book on Smallwood, and he mentioned the fact that, you know, many people said that Smallwood had a terrible temper and was a bully.
But one thing he said about that, Karl, though, that really I never forgot, was when we were actually doing the interview, he said to me, and he always called even the youngest of people Mr. or Mrs. or Miss, you know, and he called me Mr. He said, Mr. Wakeham, you know, in Monday's Telegram, Evening Telegram, this will be front page of news. In my biography, it'll be a mere asterisk. and he was absolutely right, because it was. You know.
Yeah, that's right. Now, speaking about that era, the seal hunt protesting was always worth a few column inches back at that time, with people like Bridget Bardot coming over and hanging out on the ice floes. You covered the seal hunt protests as well.
Just quite a bit, actually.
About that.
And I was up in St. Anthony, as I recall, at least 3 times. That was in my drinking days, Karl. So I think it was 2, maybe 3 times. And everybody in St. Anthony, believe me, during the seal hunt protest, everybody hung out at the bar, you know. But anyway, it was a real interesting time. You had, like you said, journalists from all around the world, and you know, so-called celebrities. People like Bridget Bardot was really famous for being famous, but that was about it, you know. And it was hard, you know, for people like me to be objective. I mean, being a Newfoundlander, obviously I detested everything that the Greenpeace Foundation and the International Fund for Animal Welfare, what they stood for. And I was sick to death of them slandering us and slandering sealers in particular, and making us out to the world to be, you know, a bunch of, you know, killers and gangsters and and slaughterers of little cute little seals. But I found I was also freelancing for, aside from doing my work for the Telegram, I was freelancing for the Globe Mail, covering the Globe Mail for covering the seal hunt for the Globe Mail, and I even did a piece for the Detroit News, I recall. But I found it easy to write objectively. That was just the nature of what I was, who I was, and I knew I had to be objective about it. But I found it very difficult to be in their company of Greenpeace and all these protesters.
Yeah.
We'd all be sitting in the same bar, you know,
Yeah.
and sometimes I could tell they were almost, I remember a couple of guys in particular were trying to goad me into a fight, you know, and trying to resist, knowing that the headline in the paper the next day would be Greenpeacer, you know, clobbered by Newfoundland reporter, and that would go around the world. You know? Right. But I remember one day in particular, this guy was really after me. And I could tell, I knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to get me into a fight, you know. And we were going back and forth, and I finally lost it and said things that I can't repeat here on TV, you know. But this friend of mine named Chuck Powers, he was with the Los Angeles Times, and he was from Missouri, and he had this Missouri drawl, and big, tall fella. And he grabbed me by the arm, and he pulled me back, and he said, "Wakeham," he said, "this is just what they want. This is just what they want." And he had a hold of me, you know. And this guy from Greenpeace, continued to try to goad me into a fight, you know, and Chuck held him back like that, and he said, he used the F word, but I won't, obviously. He said, "Listen here, F-head, you keep it up, I'm going to unleash him." And, you know, it sort of broke the tension, you know. I started laughing, but he knew that he had no chance then of getting me to clock him, you know.
Yeah. So after your period with the Telegram, you ended up moving to the, some might say, to electronic journalism with radio and television at the CBC, but only for a short period of time, because your career was derailed. You just alluded to your drinking. I don't want to dwell on it, but is there anything you'd like to say about that?
Well, I don't mind. I certainly don't mind talking about it. When I wrote a book about 10 years ago about my bout with cancer, I certainly talked about my alcoholism as well. And, you know, Karl, most people who know me know that I am an alcoholic. But my career was almost was over at the age of 32 or 33.
This was around 1980.
Well, it was around 1980, 82. You know, when I first went to Here and Now.
Yeah.
I worked.
Met.
Yes, that's where we met. I worked at radio for about a year after I quit the Telegram.
Yeah.
And the drinking was starting to have an effect on my career then, but I seemed to be able to function for short periods of time and function well, you know. So if I had to do an interview for the morning show with, Brian Peckford, I could manage to say, "Oh, for 5 minutes, I'm going to do the best interview that's been done here in the last month," and I would do that, you know. And I would get all kinds of accolades. In the meantime, I would have to leave the studio and throw up, minutes after the interview. For that 5 minutes, I could do my job. And then when I went to, people kept pushing me further ahead in my profession. Next, TV started to call me, and I got a job there and that's when we met, and I got a job for a year. And then everything fell apart. Yeah. I went from being a functional alcoholic to being a non-functioning alcoholic. And for that year I was with television, I couldn't, I was either drunk or hungover or a combination of the two. And I eventually got fired from Here and Now as a reporter. And I quit drinking, obviously, not because I got fired, and not because I'd lost my license, and not because people were starting to steer clear of me.
Yeah.
I stopped drinking ultimately because I was really, really sick, and mentally, physically, and certainly the joy had gone out of drinking, to say the least. And so I eventually stopped. But it was up to that point, it was the toughest thing I'd ever done in my life.
And when you stopped because you haven't had a drink since.
No.
But it had a very positive effect on your career, because then you come back to television as producer of On Camera, which was a documentary series, and did some great work on Camera. And I wanted you to talk about the show you did. Well, it was a two-part show about the doctor who was
Stephen Collins.
tried for sex abuse,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
Just tell it, because that was a,
Well, it
a
was
really innovative thing that you did with that.
It was, and I have to give full credit as well to Bill Gillespie, who was the host of On Camera, and I was the producer. And this case on the West Coast of this church leader, Collins, Stephen Collins, I think his name was. God, I hope I didn't
That's
get that
right,
wrong.
yeah. No, that's right. Yeah.
And he had abused a number of little girls. But the coverage got little, there was little coverage of it. In the Telegram, there were 2 or 3 paragraphs. On Here and Now, there was very, very little coverage of it, to tell the truth. So what Bill and I decided to do was to get transcripts, the transcripts of the actual trial. And then we built a mini set, or had a mini set built at CBC Studios. You know, it was a minimal sort of set, but there was a, we had the desk for the prosecutor, desk for the defense attorney, the witness box, and where the judge sat, the judge's seat. And then we made basically a docudrama. We hired local actors, Mac Furlong, people like that, and we produced this. This was very unique. It was a very different kind of take on on a trial, and also, it really exposed this whole sickness, this real hideous crime of sexual abuse. And it was difficult to get the CBC to come on stream initially, because docudramas, they might be commonplace now, but they certainly weren't back then. So I had to cajole and beg and curse and swear and get idealistic and probably holier than thou about the whole thing and dealing with the crowd in Toronto. But they finally let us go ahead, and we did, and it was an amazing success. And again, I got to give Bill an enormous amount of credit for it.
Yeah. But it was riveting television.
It was, and
was.
I remember people telling me at the time, people who have been at the CBC for a while, that we got more phone calls that particular week than anything else that had been on the air there in years, if ever. Yeah. And a lot of the phone calls that first week were very negative. People thought we were sensationalizing this trial and that we shouldn't have been so graphic in telling the story. I mean, I don't know if there was any other way to tell it but graphically. And then it seemed to turn around. The second part, the response to the second part, the phone calls that we got back then, there were no emails and such, the phone calls were really positive. And when people realized what Bill and I were trying to do, and that we weren't trying to be the National Enquirer of St. John's, it was a legitimate story, but using this docudrama format, that was what made it really unique.
Yeah. And then in 1989, you're given a whole ball of wax. You
Yes.
become the executive producer of News and Current Affairs for CBC TV in the province, and mainly responsible for the supper hour news.
Yeah, I run the risk here of sounding falsely modest, Carol, but I didn't think that would ever be my bag, or that I could do it. I just didn't think about stuff like that. The idea of being a manager wasn't what I was all about anyway, But I sort of got eased into it, or pushed into it. I was asked to be the senior producer initially, second in command, and believe me, I had to be practically hogtied and brought over to the Here and Now people. But anyway, and Ed Cody at the time was the executive producer, and Ed got himself into a mess of trouble, which was well publicized at the time, and was forced to resign. And I had to take over. Within months of having come over reluctantly as a senior producer, all of a sudden I was the executive producer. And you tell the truth, Carl, there was something very surreal about it. I mean, 6 years before, I'd been fired for drinking, for being a drunk at Here and Now I was the boss. And I remember sitting in the office that first day and saying, geez, what's happening here?
Well, I just thought it was great. I think all I could think was, what a comeback. This is fabulous, right?
Yeah.
But you made a lot of changes to Here and Now. You gave it a very different look, all for the better, in my view. Just talk about that.
Well, I tell you, I'm not sure if I gave it a lot of, thought. My whole modus operandi in the profession and outside the profession, Carol, to tell the truth, I'm more of a man who goes by instinct and my gut, So when I went to Here and Now, I just thought that there should be more to Here and Now than just the news. Obviously, the news was important. I just thought that it should have an eclectic assortment of of segments that would deal with a whole bunch of different things, and that you would know where to get it, So, and now it wasn't, there were a lot of old-fashioned news hounds there at the time who weren't all that receptive to this, but I was the boss, so I said, the hell with you, and I'm going to do it. So I would take someone out of the mix like a Debbie Collins, and she did nothing but entertainment news every week. Now, it's commonplace now, but back then it wasn't. She would just do a piece every week on some aspect of the Newfoundland arts community, and it was a big hit. I decided to hire, I wanted a commentator every night, or a satirist, and so I hired Rex Murphy and Ray Guy, arguably two of the finest Newfoundland writers who've ever been. So that was a no-brainer. We got them. And then there was Snook. Pete Soucy was just starting to do his Snook thing, and I saw it somewhere. And I said, geez, I'll hire him. So I had Snook once a week, and Noreen Golf, and I don't know if you remember, but at one point, I had you involved as you did a character. He was a storekeeper.
I did, yeah.
P. Michael
That's right.
Hines and Ray Guy wrote the script,
right.
and you were the storekeeper behind this counter.
Yeah.
So this was all stuff that people who were just used to just seeing the news and slam, bam, thank you, ma'am, and this is the news. Well, this was something that they hadn't seen on the Supper Hour show. So I just wanted it to be, God forbid, now I use the word entertainment in news gathering, but I wanted the show to be something that you wanted to watch, just not to see what went on in Newfoundland, but perhaps get an idea of why it went on, and to have things covered that were perhaps never covered before. And also, I know you're not going to be, I know you're too modest to bring this up, but I remember having a conversation with you. I remember this as if it was yesterday. It was a long time ago, Karl, but I knew that you had this very outgoing personality and that you already had a following. You were doing the weather. But I said to you, I want more. I want more from you. I want you out in the community. I want you, this natural personality you've got. I want to see you out there.
And now for the weather, let's find out where Karl Wells is tonight. Hi, Karl.
Hi, Debbie. Hi, Debbie. We are inside the igloo.
It's my first time on a chopper.
And we've got this driving rain here in Topsail tonight. I'm on a Bell Island. We're here for a March Fest. We're going down.
And that really worked. And I think at the time, you certainly embraced it. And I remember when I retired, you wrote on my retirement card, thanks for making me a star, I think. So, even the weather, even your weather segment every night became a source of entertainment, And I wanted people to, got to really get in a swell head here. It sounds like I have a swell head, but I really wanted people to not want to miss Here and Now.
Yeah.
That if they missed Here and Now, the next day I wanted them to think, geez, I must have missed something valuable, And it did work. From what I was known, I wasn't very objective, obviously, but everybody and their dog. I think there was even literally dogs watching it, and we had about 220,000 people watching Here and Now back then, which certainly was every adult in Newfoundland.
Yeah, and then when I guess you felt you'd accomplished all you could accomplish, you went back into long-form journalism with a show you created called Soundings.
Yeah, that was
also did docs for Land and Sea.
Yeah, and some national docs as well. But that was really the Soundings was the gig of a career, to tell the truth. When I first took over Here and Now, Jim Bird was my boss, our boss, fine fella, great boss, and he told me that, and Jim had been around the CBC, not just in Newfoundland, right across the country in different jobs, ultimately went on to become vice president of the CBC, obviously knew a lot about how the CBC worked, an awful lot. But when I became executive producer of Here and Now, he said to me, this is the toughest job, he said, as far as I'm concerned, in the CBC, executive producer of a Supper Hour show. So if you can get 2 or 3 years out of it, he said, I'll pull you out, I'll get you another job. And I said, okay. So I lasted 5 years. And at that point, Ron Crocker was the regional director, and he and I started talking about how I could make a gentle exit out of Here and Now. And we came up with this idea, Ron came up with this idea, to tell the truth, of Soundings. And we would produce 6 documentaries a year, just 6. But he said to me, you've got to bring more than just, it's got to be innovative. It's got to have high production values. It's got to, document. We want you to do documentaries on subjects that are super sensitive, all that sort of thing.
Make a difference.
Yes, make a difference. And also just the look of it had to be something unique. And then he asked me who I wanted to to associate with, to work with me. I said John Furlong, who was, the best journalist I knew at the time, and to tell the truth, was the best journalist I ever worked with, period. And John passed away, unfortunately, 4 or 5 years ago. So John and I had a field day for 4 years, and Ron gave us total freedom, total autonomy, and to do whatever we wanted to do and how we wanted to do it. So we produced documentaries on everything from, people who were in prison who should be in the Waterford Hospital are not in a prison. We did documentaries on the Drukin family, on the Arrow Airlines crash, alcoholism, slight conflict of interest for me. And so it was 4 years of it. In some ways, Karl, Soundings was a microcosm of what was wrong, or what started to become wrong with the CBC. It was the ratings were through the roof. We won a mittful of awards, and after 4 years, it was killed because they said there wasn't enough money to keep it going, and it was a cheap show by any standards. But anyway, it was killed, unfortunately. And then anyway, after that, I went on to do some work with Land and Sea, but I also produced the documentary that I talked about earlier, I Remain Your Loving Son. Yeah. I produced a documentary, and that went across the country. And then another on the 50th anniversary of Confederation, which I really enjoyed doing. Yeah. And I always thought Newfoundland got snookered into joining Canada, so that was a chance to, again, I wasn't too objective in this particular case, but I tried to be fair. But it was going across Canada, so I want Canadians to know how some of us at least felt about how we entered Confederation. And I did a documentary again that was aired across Canada on the Ocean Ranger tragedy. Mm-hmm. So but the idea, the fact that I had an awful lot of freedom and autonomy continued right until, I ultimately retired.
Bob, your career abruptly ended around the time you were doing Soundings, and I want to get into that story because it's a riveting story. But we don't have time on this show, so will you come back for part 2?
Sure, Karl.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you, Karl. Great seeing you again.
Bob Wakeham, ladies and gentlemen.